Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Streamline User Provisioning in ERP Applications. I'm Emma, and I'll be your moderator today. I work on the marketing team here at SafePass, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, SafePass Senior GRC Solutions Director, Bob Enders. A very warm welcome to you, Bob. But before I hand over to Bob, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. So please, if you have a question, then please feel free to ask. We'll be answering the questions at the end of the session. So you can just pop those in the question box. And if we don't get to your questions during today's webinar, then we will be sure to follow up with you afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming Bob. Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everybody. To begin with, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join our webinar today. We're going to discuss ways to improve user provisioning with workflows and policy monitoring. Once again, I'm Bob Enders, Senior Director with SafePass. I've been in the software industry pretty much my entire career. Been well over 30 years, and for the past 10 years, I've been helping organizations with risk management and remediation, and most recently helping organizations improve their provisioning process. What I've got shown today is the agenda that I've got planned for today's session. The introduction.
Sorry, Bob, would you like to share your screen with everybody, please?
I thought it automatically shared. I'm sorry. Is it sharing now?
Yes, it is. Yes, that's fine.
Sorry about that. I thought when I clicked one button, it automatically shared everything. So I apologize. What we're going to do, I want to introduce at SafePass who we are, the nature of our business. We'll talk about user provisioning overview and some of the challenges and complexities that are involved with user provisioning. Then we'll talk about access policy compliance, because organizations have to comply with certain regulatory requirements and any internal policy they need to accommodate. And then we're going to go through an example using Oracle Applications for a user security assignment. It sounds like a pretty straightforward process, but it's much more involved and complex than most people are aware of. And then we'll go into self-service user provisioning and how we can improve that process with a product that SafePass provides called iAccess. And then we'll just introduce a case study of one of our clients that have improved their overall provisioning process, but also their risk management capabilities with SafePass. And then, as Emma had mentioned, feel free to submit any questions you have. We'll answer those at the end of today's session. Okay, so with that, I'll get started. For introductions, obviously, I introduced myself. Once again, we're SafePass. We're a consulting and software firm that has focused on risk management and helping organizations establish control framework. We've been involved in a lot of thought leadership activities. The founder of SafePass had co-authored a book with Oracle on a GRC for Oracle Applications. We attend quite a few conferences, both Oracle and non-Oracle conference, because we're somewhat, can accommodate any application. Most recently, we were at the ISACA conference last week, and we had a very good conference there. Some of the other things that we're involved with, Gartner has recognized SafePass as the most complete solution for application security controls in the marketplace. And as you can tell, we involved in some of the other events, LinkedIn, Open World, and so forth. Once again, we're, provide some thought leadership in this area. That's our area of expertise. We have over 250 clients. Many of these are consulting clients, but also SafePass solution clients. And as you can tell, we cover a lot of different vertical industries. So we have a lot of pretty broad and deep knowledge when it comes to helping organizations identify and manage risk within the organization. But for today's session, we're going to focus on the user provisioning process. So let's talk a little bit about the provisioning overview and why is that important. When you really think about it, and when I talk to different clients, it's all about risk. What's the risk of giving somebody too much access to too many capabilities that they could perform functions that might be questionable within the organization? What happens when we give somebody access to key configurations that could affect how the application operates, and they're not well schooled or shouldn't have the capabilities to begin with? Or if we give access to private information of individuals, so once again, risk of access is, given too much access to certain individuals that shouldn't have that level of access. So let's kind of dig into this a little bit further. So when you look at some of the challenges, as we know, the technology changes all the time. Over the course of my career, we went from siloed systems to ERP systems. Now we're going to the cloud. And the cloud kind of takes me full circle back to when things were a little bit more siloed, but much more sophisticated. But now you have cloud computing. You've got on-premise ERPs. You've got access through digital devices, mobile phones. It's a variety of different ways that you can get access to applications with the changes in technology. When we look at provisioning, it's very manual in its efforts. A lot of times it's an email, a phone call to a help desk, maybe a ticket to the help desk, a paper form, the IT administrators involved. So once again, you've got a very manual process, but also each application has its own way of provisioning user access. And Oracle e-Business Suite has one, SAP has another, PeopleSoft has a different one, JD Edwards has another one, Oracle Workday has a different one. So once again, it's very fragmented in how you give people access to different applications. And there's also a lot of individuals involved in the process. There's the requester that requests access for themselves or for someone on their staff. There's the actual user that's getting the access. Then it goes to the reviewers and approvers. Who are those reviewers and approvers? It could be for policy violations, for compliance to certain requirements, making sure that somebody doesn't have access to private information or protected information. So once again, there's a lot of touch points, and when you look at this graph, you've got individuals that touch multiple applications and multiple roles and different processes for provisioning user access into an organization's application. So as you can tell, it gets a little bit cumbersome and somewhat messy just because of the lack of structure and process around provisioning. And if you think about it, those that are involved in the provisioning process, there's typically hundreds of adds and changes and deletes requests every day. Take away this responsibility or role from this individual, or this functionality away from this individual. Add new users, new employees. Once again, it's an ongoing process that's very tedious to a degree based on the overall requirements. And as I described, it's inconsistent ad hoc manual in most cases, and it's based on the application. Once again, EBS is different than PeopleSoft, is different than SAP, is different than Microsoft Dynamics. So they're all different, and it creates a level of lack of process and controls around the process. Disparate provisioning tools and workflows, once again, as I described, they're all different. Individuals, applications will require certain setups differently across each application. Once again, as I described, many touch points. You got multiple individuals that are part of the process, and depending on the organization, each person will have a different level of responsibility as to how to address those requests. Some of the challenges: no consistent policy enforcement. What are my policies? I need to ensure that I'm not giving somebody what I'm going to call toxic access or combinations of access into their applications. Even though I may have separate applications, maybe one for financials and like SAP, and you may have Workday for HR payroll. But what happens if you give somebody access to both? And it's a toxic combination. You need to be able to manage and identify that. No common controls or audit trail. It's all manual. It's either spreadsheets or emails or phone calls or tickets. And how do you track that once it's being requested? And one of the things that we're seeing and talking with clients is that there's always a request of who approved this person's access. Because a lot of the clients we work with will always identify the client will always identify people's access that are causing policy violations. And it's usually after the fact once they've been given access. And also, it's very difficult to ensure compliance and access risk. Once again, in a manual activity, when you've got, and I'll use Oracle e-Business Suite as an example again, there's over 30,000 access points, and those access points in combination could cause policy violations. It's difficult to visualize, given all those access points, where is somebody causing violations? Now, organizations do SOD validation, but they do it at a very, very high level. They do it at the responsibility or role level. But the reality is you need to go all the way down to the form and function level to make sure you're not creating a policy violation. When you look at the provisioning process, you know, user access is the most common problem when it comes to IT audits. Look at Gartner survey, 44% IT audit deficiencies are access related. And then to Ernst & Young says 7 of the top 10 control deficiencies are related to access, user access. So once again, it's a big area, it's a very important area, because once again, the potential risk associated with giving people the wrong access. So how does this occur? A lot of times it's orphaned accounts. An individual comes to work for an organization, and they eventually leave for whatever reason, but they've never been deprovisioned properly. So now you've got a user and password out there that's got access to the application, that if somebody were to have that combination of information, they could, you know, access and perform transactions that they shouldn't have access to. So once again, orphaned accounts is very common. You got to improve the deprovisioning process in order to address that. Rogue accounts, and to me, rogue accounts are strictly fraud related. Somebody comes in, sets up an account that nobody knows about, they've got the right level of access, and then that account sits out there with no knowledge of who created it, when it was created, what it has access to. And eventually, if you perform some sort of SOD analysis and automate it as best, it eventually becomes known. But rogue accounts occur when, as I mentioned, somebody comes in, sets it up for fraudulent purposes. So you obviously definitely want to identify those. Privileged users. Privileged users, every organization has them. It's the so-called super user that has to have a lot of access into the applications to address any performance or functionality issues that arise during daily use of the application. And these privileged users have quite a bit of access. And this is another area that the audit community is focusing on, because you know, it's a high-risk area. Somebody can log in as their super user capabilities, perform a certain function or set of functions, and then nobody's going to know about it, and the system will process accordingly. So this is an area that's getting more and more visibility from the audit community. And then entitlement creep. Entitlement creep comes about when an individual changes roles in their organization. Usually with a change of roles, they get new responsibilities or roles, so that gives them different access into the application to perform certain functions. And a lot of times, they need to retain their old roles and responsibilities, because they're still transitioning from one role to a new role, and also helping, you know, in that transition. So a certain period of time, they've got to have that dual access. So this is where entitlement creep comes about, and how do you address that? You know, to minimize risk. So once again, it's important to have a solid deprovisioning process. Once it is designated that an individual's no longer has access to certain parts of the application, it should automatically shut off. So that's it, the user provision overview. I want to also talk about access policy compliance. When you set up a role, the role decides a lot of privileges as to what's available to that specific role and those users that are granted that role. It's essentially who can do what and which sets of data. So that controls, the role itself controls what the person has access to from a function standpoint, but also from a data standpoint. Some of the examples here, you've got procurement manager, channel sales manager, chief financial officer, HR specialist. Those are roles that are defined within the application. And those roles are assigned individuals. And those roles will also determine privileges they have, what they can provide. Reassign a purchasing document, manage a purchase order changes. Let's see, those are examples of the privileges that are available that are in that role. And then also, when you define a role, you decide what data is relevant to that particular role. So if I have an operating unit, depending on how I've got my application configured, and I want to limit individuals accessing that operating unit, I would do that within the role that's assigned for that user. The example here, the role says you can view all purchase orders. You can update item purchase orders for Germany or hire buyers in Germany. So I can restrict through a role and how it's defined what information and data I have access to perform certain transactions. So once again, the role is the controlling the role definition is a controlling factor. And then also when you start looking at the access that they have, once again, which data they have access to, but also the level of access. Is it just read, write, delete, create? So you can control what a person is able to do through a role that takes you to the appropriate form. And then the condition, there may be certain conditions that need to be met before that individual can perform a certain transaction. So if we look at the example that we've got listed here, below we've got as an employee, I may have, I can view my own employee salary. And if I have direct reports, I have the ability to view and update the direct reports. Once again, that's the condition that's associated with my role that allows me to do that. And then also from another example for sales opportunity, I can view and update opportunities that are associated with my sales reps in my territory, but also I can view all opportunities. So once again, when you define the role and you assign it to an individual, it dictates what that individual is capable of, what he has access to, and capable of transactions that they can execute. But when most organizations, we start evaluating user access, it's important for them to review what level of access, and is it also in compliance with any of our policies. So when you start looking at the user itself, okay, the user has certain roles and responsibilities. Roles and responsibilities have menus, submenus. Under those menus and submenus, you have functions, and then under the functions, you have forms that allow you to execute those functions. So it's a very straightforward process, drill down, as you're probably familiar with as an ERP user. But from a risk standpoint, a lot of organizations only view a user's responsibilities as to what they have access to. And a lot of times responsibilities are poorly defined. And because they're poorly defined, it could give access that they shouldn't necessarily have. So from an actual risk management standpoint, you want to look at the user, but you want to go all the way down to the form level. We've worked with clients over the course of our projects where the roles and responsibilities were poorly defined. And a lot of times these responsibilities, even though it may have said GL inquiry, they had a lot more ability than the GL inquiry would indicate. And so they were reviewing the policy at the responsibility level, but in actuality, it's important to do it at the form level. So you make sure that the function and form is appropriate for the individual that has access to those functions and forms. And so once again, this is centers around managing segregation of duties, where you can identify incompatible privileges and capabilities, and that way you can manage any policy violations accordingly. And so that's the key thing you want to manage from an access standpoint. But during the provisioning process, there's a lot more going on and becomes a lot more sophisticated. So when we start looking at actual compliance, every organization needs to address certain control requirements. Is their ERP system access protected? Am I aware of any potential access violations that may exist within the ERP if I'm the person responsible for access within the application? Do we conform to access policy? Most organizations have access policies that they use to determine if a person has appropriate access or not. And it's important that they are considered when a person is given access. And also, what do we do when we identify an incident? An incident is a policy violation. What's our approach to addressing that violation? And from the projects that we've worked on, obviously the ideal situation is to fix it in the ERP. Whatever you can, either take away user access, redesign the responsibilities, redesign the roles, because those will have the biggest impact when it comes to policy monitoring at least from a segregation of duties standpoint. A lot of times it's much more complex when you're actually going through the provisioning process, the inability to translate corporate governance into IT policy. Obviously, we just mentioned segregation of duties, that's one thing, but also data privacy. Certain information is regulated as far as who should have access. And so you also want to make sure not only you're not giving access that violates a SOD policy, but also doesn't violate any privacy policies. And you want to do control testing on a regular basis to make sure whatever controls you have in place are effective. But the challenge is a lot of times it's still manual. So you're faced with emails or spreadsheets doing the testing of certain controls. Obviously, human error wherever you have individuals involved is always a concern, and it leads to inconsistencies when it comes to actually reviewing testing. And also, data is sometimes hard to obtain and missing. And a lot of times when you're trying to pull out data for whatever control test you're looking at, to get that data from the ERP takes much more technical knowledge than most people typically have. But also you can obviously leverage your current staff to do that. But it's important to get the information that you're looking for. And then also it's difficult to help the business understand some of the issues around compliance and access. A lot of times, in this case, no ability to manage identity through a business lens, lack of transparency. As a business owner, and I have access to the application, I may not understand some of the technical nuances of the access that either myself or somebody else might have, and so it's hard to visualize what that means to the organization. And a lot of times, the IT terminology or processes that they go through to provision are not fully understood by the business. So once again, it becomes a little bit of a challenge, and when you're managing your access to ensure that you're complying with your compliance requirements. So what I want to do next, give an example of user security assignment, and we're using Oracle Applications as an example. And so for those that are Oracle e-business suite users, this might be in your involvement provisioning process, looks very familiar. This is where you give a user access. Here we've got obviously a user, and the usernames are defined based on whatever criteria the organization specifies. And it's assigned to an HR record, so you know it's an actual individual that's recognized by the HR organization. You have your password. What's the unique password for that individual, and also what's the expiration policy? Any days, accesses, and so forth. So that way you're minimizing the use of the same password for a long period of time. You can activate or inactivate a user with this form. Very common task for the provisioning and deprovisioning process. And also an individual can be assigned one or more responsibilities assigned to this user. So that would give that user access into different parts of the application. And so when you look at the responsibilities assigned, you got, as I described earlier, you got many submenus and submenus. And then the menu determines what functions and forms are available to that user for each of those responsibilities. So this seems like a pretty straightforward process, very common, nothing overly difficult. So once again, it's a common practice when you're an e-business client to give users access. The challenge becomes, what does it look like underneath? So it's a lot more complex than the screens that we just showed indicate. So when you give somebody user access in different responsibilities, it becomes obviously a web of capabilities underneath from a technical perspective. In this case, we have John Doe has access all the way down to the ability to initiate invoice batches. And maybe that's a problem for John Doe, and maybe John Doe shouldn't have the ability to enter an invoice and also submit invoice batches. So the recommendation might be firsthand is just to take it away. Okay, remove that function. But when you do that, you could be impacting somebody else's access, because these menus and submenus can be shared with other responsibilities. Here we've got Mike Jones, who has access to the same end function of entering invoice batches, but he goes with different responsibility, but it shares one of the submenus, the AP invoice entry, that gives you that access to that function. So if I take it away from John Doe, it'll also impact Mike Jones. So I have to really think about making that change. And also, I may have another payable user that has a different responsibility, but also performs the same function, that also shares some of the menus that the other responsibilities have. So, excuse me, as you can see, the remediation to address a person's access isn't so simple. Yeah, you want to make sure that when you make these changes, you're not impacting the business and their ability to operate based on the day-to-day activities. So once again, it's just because the remediation is an important process, but it's a lot more involved than just taking away functions from certain individuals. And this is where the root cause analysis is required for remediation. What are those responsibilities? What do I do with those responsibilities? So that's the challenge, and that's where a lot of the remediation work occurs, but also it's usually time consuming where you have to involve the business process to review each one of those areas. So what I want to talk about next is the self-service user provisioning process. How do we improve the process so it's consistent, has structure, and it's auditable with and you can validate the end results. That's where Access Pass comes into play. Safe Pass is our company. It's the name of also the name of our products. But Access Pass is the solution that helps with user provisioning, or I should say access management. And under Access Pass is iAccess. And as you can tell by just looking at this graph, we support multiple applications, SAP, Microsoft, PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, Workday. So once again, we support any application, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. And we're helping organizations to improve the processes around risk management and controls. In this particular conversation, we're talking about the user provisioning process. So those that are involved with user provisioning, it's important to understand that this is an ongoing process. The request to get access, policy violations, tracking and reporting, regulatory reporting, and the provisioning life cycle is ongoing. So it's a continuous process that occurs between obviously the users of the application and your IT department, but also whoever else might be involved in the process. And as described here, we have the business owners that either request or review the process. You have your help desk that initiates the effort, the actual user that's going to be given access to the application, but also your security team that's going to validate to make sure that by giving that person access, you're not giving them access that that person shouldn't have. And once again, we tie that all together with iAccess. So when we start looking at self-service access management, as I described, it's a product that we provide called iAccess that helps you put structure around the process. So you're moving from a fragmented approach to centralized visibility and control. So you're going from, in some cases, manual to an automated solution that provides that structure around the process. You can identify controls in the business process. So it's an automated process. Whatever control violations you have when you go through the provisioning process, it does a validation as part of the process. And the value is I want to catch the violations at the beginning instead of giving somebody access, and I find out when I run an SOD analysis to see if there's any violations. iAccess gives you the opportunity to identify at the beginning and make a determination if that's the level of access you want to allow. There's a friendly business layer, very user-friendly, easy to use, removes a lot of the complexity of the technology away from the users that are reviewing the provisioning process, and also helps both the business and technical users. It actively measures and monitors risks associated with users and resources, so you'll know where the risks are coming from when you give users access. So this kind of gives you just a quick overview of the self-service user provisioning process. We'll get a little bit more into that as we go, but I wanted to just touch on a case study that we had done with one of our clients, and it was a large auto manufacturer that had 5 different ERPs that they were managing, not only user provisioning, but also segregation of duties requirements. And so their challenge was, it was with 5 different applications and thousands of users, obviously became much more onerous task to provision users, but also you want to monitor their policy impact when you give them that access. So they deployed the SafePass. This were the results. They were able to eliminate 80% of the manual steps and over $50,000 in annual cost savings in audit and remediation costs. And that doesn't say about the individuals involved in the provisioning process, how we've automated a very manual activity. Have access policies to ensure compliance. So once again, we're catching the violations at the front end of the provisioning process and not after a person's been given access and subsequently determined with an SOD review. We're lowered ERP total cost of ownership because they're reducing the head count that had to manage the provisioning process given all the different systems that they had. They've improved SOD and access controls testing time because the auditors would have complete access to all the information that went along with the provisioning process. iAccess tracks all the workflow approvals and where it's at in the process. They can generate a report very simply to validate who approved what. And also it accelerated the ERP access approval time because they were able to identify the SOD violation at the very beginning of the provisioning process. When you also look at some of the key things that are, look at the provisioning challenges, do the ERP roles meet the requirements for all users? Does the user provisioning prevent security policy violations? How do you monitor super user activities? Because that's usually mandatory in most organizations. How do you protect sensitive data? How do you detect segregation of duties? So, what do you do to maintain an audit trail of your configuration controls? Also master data changes. And how do you ensure that a terminated employee can't access the ERP? So once again, these are all challenges when it comes to user provisioning, but also from a risk management standpoint, you need to address these challenges. That's why, as I mentioned, I introduced iAccess. iAccess is our solution to improve the user provisioning process. And this is basically a flow that helps you understand the tasks and activities that occur as part of deploying and using iAccess. Obviously, you need to have your SOD's rules. So if you look at the first swim lane, that's where that's identified. And those rules can come from our catalog that we have. Also, if you have some custom rules or that you need to include, those are very easily added. And also, you need to have your active employee users. And so you have to certify those users that are allowed access to the ERP. A lot of organizations, if I've got 5,000 employees total, not all 5,000 are going to be accessing the ERP. So it'd be a limited group of individuals that have to be certified and registered before they can give an access using iAccess. Once you registered an individual, then you can request the roles. And when you request the roles and submit it for the review process, it initiates an SOD review. So any SOD rules that are violated, they'll be identified before that person is approved access through the workflow. And it can take any new responsibility or roles that are assigned to it and leverage it against any existing roles or responsibilities that are assigned to it. So once again, it identifies what those policy violations might be. Once again, the key is before it's actually deployed into the ERP. And then it routes it to workflow. And so once the rules are finished, it does a workflow to up to 5 reviewers and approvers. And then each one of those has the opportunity to accept or reject that request. And upon final approval, it can automatically update the ERP with that user if you still choose that as your approach. But then also as you go through the process, you may see roles that need to be redesigned. And there's a solution that we provide called Roles Manager that helps with addressing and monitoring or changing any roles that are causing intra-SOD violations. So we'll talk about in a little bit. Then eventually you could monitor application access on a regular basis with SafePass. So once again, as we look at the case study, the idea was to provision roles to the user, the things we want to cost, improve help productivity, enhance security, and reduce support costs. So as I go through these slides, as I mentioned previously, you want to, for the provisioning process, you need to identify your SOD rules. What rules are important to you from an access standpoint that you want to validate user access against? And these roles are, as I described, they're totally user defined. You can leverage them off our catalog, or you can, enter your own rules yourselves. As I previously mentioned, you have to have a user registration, and that user registration, can be done in mass or individual. But the important point here is that we don't want to give people access that shouldn't have access. So the user registration process eliminates those individuals that should never have access to the ERP. If they're not registered, they won't even appear on a pick list to give access to. And then user provisioning, this is just an email notification that an individual has been registered, and will be notified if there's any questions from their manager. And then this is another registration slide that this individual has been workflow to say, okay, this person's been registered, is it approved or rejected? So once again, however you set up workflow for user registration will dictate who the individuals are that will determine who should have access. And this is the form that you would use to give an individual access. And as you can tell, obviously there's a username, manager name. You can also end date a user's access here. So if I want to have a single point of user management, you can also deprovision individuals through iAccess. And then you can pick and choose the roles or responsibilities and assign it to this individual for review. Also, I just want to point out we also support Firefighter, which is designed for managing super users. And as you go through the requesting process, we use emails to notify the end user that's going to be receiving the access, but also the workflow approvers. So the workflow approvers will get an email, so they don't have to be in the application, with a hyperlink into the application so they can review and approve or reject a access request. So this is the form that the individual have access to. Once again, they can look at the SOD violations and do this form, and then based on their review and of the results, they can approve or reject it. If they approve it, it moves on to the next step in the workflow. If they're rejected, it automatically stops the workflow, and they're required to put a comment in there as to why it was being rejected and sends it back to the originator. And upon final approval, in this case, eBusiness Suite or the ERP can be updated with that user's access. So it automates the entire process from requesting access all the way through the actual provisioning that user access, and then sending emails and notifications throughout the process to keep everybody aware. And eventually, as the user is given access, they'll be getting a username and a temporary password in an email that they would obviously use to access the application. We also provide very sophisticated risk analytics. So once you provision the user's access, then you do the regular SOD monitoring, so you can identify any violations that any user in the application could be causing. And this is just a graphic of some of the analytics that we provide. You can identify the top 10 SOD rules that have violations. I can also identify which responsibilities have violations, also the users with violations. And when you think about it from a usability standpoint, this helps you define a remediation strategy. If I've got violations, I've got to take a stepwise approach to how do I address those violations. And as I described previously, our recommendation is fix it in the ERP, because if I can fix it in the ERP, I could have a significant impact on the end results of the SOD. Just changing one responsibility could knock out potentially 1,000 violations, depending on what that fix might be. But once again, the graphics that we provide gives you an understanding of what that remediation strategy might be. Because looking at rows and columns makes it very difficult to understand the data, but also make decisions around the data. I described, as I just previously described, with roles design, you can build SOD compliant roles and responsibilities very simply and not being a technical user. I can change a role. I do it outside of the ERP, so any changes that I make aren't impacting day-to-day operations, but I can identify any SOD violations that are caused by just the design of that role and eliminate those. So once again, that's another remediation step that we typically see with a lot of clients, depending on how their roles are defined. So that kind of concludes today's session. So if you have any questions with respect to what we covered, now's the time to submit those.
We have had a question come in, Bob. Is there a way to prevent providing role or responsibility inadvertently to a user?
Yes, there is. It's a concept within iAccess called access groups. So I can define certain responsibilities according to their access group, and then assign users to that same access group. When I do that, the only thing that will appear is when I have matching access groups. So if I have a user that has the same access group, I will only see responsibilities that are associated with that access group. Eliminates potential for inadvertently providing access that they shouldn't have.
Okay, great. And I think you touched on this previously, but can you manage access by privileged or super users?
Yeah, I described that earlier. That's our firefighter ID capabilities. One of the things that we're seeing in the market, a lot of auditors are focusing on the super user access because it's in most organizations it's perpetual and there's no real tight controls around it. So we've devised Firefighter that allows you to limit a super user access for a certain period of time. So then when you make the request to iAccess, it'll only give you those responsibilities that are designated as firefighter or super user. And then once you give that access, it's automatically shuts off based on whatever your configuration is, 1 day, 2 days. But then also using Monitor Pass will go out and interrogate what that person had done while they had access to those specific roles and responsibilities. So it once again limits that unlimited access that they currently have, but also does a certification of what transactions or forms they touched, so you can validate that they hadn't done anything that was unexpected.
Okay, great. Well, I think that wraps up today's session. So we hope that you found it informative, and we look forward to seeing you at our webinar in June. So if you do have any questions, or if you'd like to discuss anything further, then please contact either myself or Bob, and we'd be more than happy to get back to you. So until next time, thank you.
And if interested, you can go to our website and sign up for a free evaluation. Thanks everybody for your time. And once again, as Emma suggested, you can contact herself or me for any questions you have. Thank you.